Goodwill has a rich heritage, going back 121 years in the U.S. and now 100 years in Kentucky. When Goodwill came to Kentucky in 1923, there were already 25 Goodwills in other U.S. cities, and the founder, Edgar Helms, was spending a lot of his time traveling around the country to spread goodwill to other places. And we know that Helms made at least 11 visits to Kentucky. For the first few decades, most Goodwills were formed through the efforts of the Methodist Church, and they were often funded by the church. That influence extended through the 1970s, when most Goodwill executive directors were Methodist ministers, and virtually all Goodwills had chapel services. But it started to wane in the 1960s when Goodwills started accepting more government funding because that placed some limits on their religious activities. We were first called Louisville Goodwill, and our first home was in the Trinity Temple Methodist Church, downtown at the northeast corner of 3rd and Guthrie Streets. Our founder, John Lowe Fort, was a minister for that church, and he was paid by the church, not by Goodwill, since Goodwill didn't have any funds. Within a few years, Goodwill moved out of the church building and bought the Vogel Shoe Company on 8th Street, just south of Market. They were able to make a down payment with some donated funds to buy a 5-story building. So then they had space to repair their used goods. They had a shoe department, a furniture department, a clothing department, and so on. Several years later, they were able to buy property around the corner from that plant on Market Street, and they used that property for a settlement house and a larger store. In 1947, Louisville Goodwill became Goodwill Industries of Kentucky, since by that time they had operations in several other Kentucky towns. At some point, a separate Goodwill had been formed in Lexington, and in 1958, their board asked Goodwill Kentucky to take over their operation, and that was done. But we didn't reach our current 103 county territory until the 1980s, when Roland Blahnik, director at that time, asked Goodwill Industries of America to add all the unassigned territory in Kentucky to Goodwill Kentucky's footprint. That added counties in the far eastern and the far western parts of Kentucky, and so then they began expanding into those parts of the Commonwealth. Like our current housing efforts, Goodwill Kentucky has some history of providing housing since its early days. I mentioned a settlement house in the Market Street property, and there was also a Fred and Lily Schmidt home in the 1940s, and that was primarily for employees who needed housing. The Goodwill mission was always to help people become employed so that they could have a better life. In the early years, Goodwill accomplished that by employing poor people and helping them with other needs that they had. In those early decades, employees were people who had disabilities, older people, immigrants, anyone who had a hard time finding a job, really a pretty broad range. But after World War II and as increased government funding became available, Kentucky Goodwill and most other Goodwills started focusing more on people with disabilities and also added a lot of services for people who were not employed by Goodwill. Today, we've come full circle to some extent, and we intentionally hire people who other employers are reluctant to take a chance on. They may have a disability, but more often today, their barrier is past involvement with our justice system. And that's often as a result of the addiction that is so widespread in Kentucky. We offer a lot of resources and supports to our own employees to help them stabilize their lives. But we also have a lot of services for people who become employed by other businesses. Because our goal is to provide pathways out of poverty, whether that pathway begins with initial employment at Goodwill or not. We honor the 100-year history of Goodwill Industries of Kentucky by making sure that we don't lose that basic concept of the dignity of work and the important role that work plays in quality of life. That belief is what led Edgar Helms to start Goodwill in Boston, and it's also the belief that led John Lowe Fort to bring Goodwill to Kentucky. And we believe that concept is just as true now as it was 100 years ago. We've also continued what Edgar Helms started in collecting used goods that people didn't want anymore and using them to provide work for people. We don't repair those used goods anymore, but we do still use them to provide work opportunities in Goodwill stores for people who need a chance to show what they can do. Both those threads are still woven into the work we do today.